Hello everybody and welcome back to my sewing room. If you celebrated Christmas, I hope you and your family and friends had a really lovely time. And if you didn't, I hope that you've managed to get something done over the Christmas period. I'm wearing my sparkly jumper as it's the end of the year almost. It's the 28th of December and it's that time of year when you're sort of looking back, well I am looking back in my journal and looking at things that I managed to do and things that I'd hoped to do but didn't. So I'm working on my journal, and it's also a time of completely sorting out my sewing room. So my last couple of videos, if you've watched those, they were to do with using up spare blocks, orphan blocks, if you had any of those. I have some in a spare block box, still have trouble saying that. And I decided that before the new year came in, I would use all of those up in different quilts. I do have one left. Oops, I'll show you that one. It's a courthouse steps variation, but I'm not counting that one. I'm not going to put this one into a quilt because I'm going to back that, and that will be a pocket. I'm going to make myself a tote bag, so that's going to be inside the tote bag as a pocket. It's those sorts of colours I'm going to use, so I'm not counting that one. And there was one left, and it was this one with the bees on. So I'd made this block quite a while ago. I made a bee quilt and it's a sort of daisy design, and this block ended up there because the half square triangles around the outside, they were on the bias and they had gone a little bit wavy, and so I didn't include those in the original quilt, but I thought I could fix that and include that in this quilt, and that's what I did. So let's have a look and see how this quilt came into being. So the first thing I did was to take away some of the excess fabric that was in the seams causing it to wave. So I just took a little bit of the seams in and sorted that problem out first of all, and then I looked into my fabric stash and found any sorts of bits of fabric that I had that had bees on. There wasn't very much, so I thought, okay, I'll start with that and we'll work our way around. And those bees on the blue background I decided not to include in this quilt. They look quite young, I thought, and I thought they would look really nice in an I Spy quilt. They're 2.5 inch squares, and so I've decided not to include those, so I set those aside. And it didn't take me long to realise that I haven't got very much bee fabric in my stash, and so I did a little simple design, and thinking that the quilt might be 40 inch plus, round about that, a little lap size quilt. So it's based on a medallion quilt. There's a feature in the centre, and then there's borders all the way around. And as I've been tidying up my stash, I realised I've got quite a lot of that yellow plaid. Some I'd pre-cut into 3-inch strips, so I'd obviously used that somewhere in a quilt before. And I also had 4 3/4-inch strips, so the outside of this quilt is made up with those 4 3/4-inch bands. So I found those and thought they would work well with the blue and yellow in the centre of that quilt. So the first thing I did was to use some of those 3-inch strips to border the centre block, and I thought that looked quite nice. I haven't got any of that pale blue with the polka dots on, whilst I would have used that if I'd have had any. And once I'd made that first block, I was then able to size up the quilt. So I'm looking at multiples of 3 inches, so there'll be 3-inch squares, 3-inch half square triangles, or 3-inch strips. And I will put that design on my community page. People have asked me how they find my community page. It's just on my YouTube homepage. So if you go onto my YouTube homepage, look along, you'll see on the top row there's a word community. If you hit that, you'll find all the letters, and I usually put my designs on there and the sizes of the blocks. So the first thing I did was to count up these 4 3/4-inch squares that I had in the green, and then I cut up that part of a fat quarter 1/4 into 4 3/4 inch squares and 3-inch squares. I was looking to make 8 of the little daisy blocks. I didn't have enough of the bee fabric to complete all 8, so I had 4 in the plain white and 4 in the bee fabric, and I wanted a really bright yellow for the centre of those daisy blocks. And if you look at that centre of the medallion, you can just see there's a little star shape in a bright yellow, and I thought that would really work together. So that's the centre of those blocks, is a really bright sunshine yellow. And over the Christmas period I didn't get very much time in my sewing room, and so when I was able to get in, if I could chain piece, I did. And so I chain pieced all of those squares together. So I prepared all of these blocks, and then whenever I got an opportunity to sneak in and put some together, I did. So they were all ready, just waiting for me. Like I say, not much time, but I was very productive with the time I did have. So the first thing I did was to put the pinwheels together. And then I just added a 3-inch by 5.5-inch strip to the bottom. I'm lucky that I didn't have to give up my sewing room over the Christmas period. It's just that I didn't have time to come in. What I did manage to do was to use the design wall. So as I finished part of the quilt, I was able to just put it on the wall. This is one of the things for 2024 that was really good. I'd hummed and hawed for quite a while about having a design wall, and it's been brilliant. I wish I had done it earlier. And that's the layout for those little pinwheels. And then I decided that I would make these little daisy blocks with the bees on that would fit in the centre of each side. And so I put those together and they would fit like that. So I was happy with the way that those daisies with the bees on looked, and I liked the way they worked with the pinwheels. I didn't have enough, like I said, of that bee fabric, and so I then made 4 of solid white to go in each corner, and I put those in next. I was happy with the way that that worked. That white really stands out against that darker green. And then I used those 4 3/4 inch strips to put a border on. On the design you can see that I've used a 3-inch in a yellow and a 3-inch in the green as a border, but because that was such a find, I thought I'll use that instead. So the yellow border went on next. I did have to piece it. It wasn't enough to go all the way around in solid pieces, but I think it's okay. And I just put a narrow border of the green just to tie everything together. So I went into my batting stash and I took out all the pieces and I pieced these together so that I had enough to make the batting for this quilt. And I wanted to use up all of the bits of the bee fabric, or as much of it as I could, and so I decided that any bits that I had left over I would put together and I would use it in the back. So I put some stars together, managed to get 3 variable stars, and then I used a little bit of scraps together to make an improv block, and I made a strip to go down the back of the quilt. So you can see from this image that I was just measuring the length next to the quilt on the wall. So just pinning it up on the design wall next to the quilt and having a look and seeing if it was long enough. And I did buy a little bit of backing to finish it off. So it's that lovely lime green, and I just put that panel in there. I think it looks really pretty, the back. I love a pieced back. And so I always think it's a nice surprise, isn't it, for someone when they have a look at a quilt. And so that's the back. And I'll show you a close-up of that panel down the back. As you can see, I quilted in a simple crosshatch on my machine, and there's a label for Project Linus, and that's it all finished now. It measures 43 inches square, and I'll get that washed, and that will be the first quilt that goes off to Project Linus for 2025. My aim for 2024 was to make at least one quilt a month for Project Linus, and in the end I managed with this one to make 16, so pretty good going. I think I'll have that as one of my aims for 2025 too, to make at least one Project Linus quilt a month. So that's it for 2024. If you do celebrate the new year, have a wonderful time, and I'll see you in 2025. Happy sewing. I've got lots and lots and lots of designs, too many, buzzing around my head. The first two have been requests from family members, but they're quite simple to put together, so they'll be quite quick to do. So, and then, I don't know, we'll see what the year brings. So have a really, really lovely end of year, and happy sewing, and thank you again for being on my YouTube journey with me. Take really good care of yourselves. Bye.